Chapters 25 through 28 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 25. Robinson again explores his island. When Robinson recovered his strength, he had a strong desire to see more of the island. At first he had been in constant fear of wild animals, but now, he thought, he would like to see all there was to see in the island. On the 15th of July he started out. First he went to a brook which ran into the sea near his cave. Its water was clear and pure. Along its shore lay beautiful meadows. As he came to the upper course of the brook, the meadow gave way to forest. On the border of the forest he found melons and grapes. The night came on and he slept again in a tree. The next morning he went farther and came to a clear rivulet. Here the region was wonderfully beautiful. The flowers bloomed as in a garden, and near the flowers stood splendid apple and orange trees. He took as much of the fruit as he could carry and went on his way. This journey continued 3 days. The grapes which he had carried he dried in the sun and made raisins. The 10th of September came. 1 year had passed on the island. He was many hundred miles from home, alone on an island. With tears he cried out, "Oh, what are my dear parents saying? They have no doubt long given me up as dead. If I could only send them a message to comfort them and let them know how much I love them." The day was celebrated as a holiday. He thanked God that he had given him so many good things. Often he had lived the whole day in care and anxiety. Now he tried to be more cheerful and meet the troubles of each day with courage. But Robinson was not yet satisfied. He longed to know more of the island and prepared himself for a greater journey. He slung his hunting pouch over his shoulder, filled it with food, took his bow and arrows, stuck his stone hatchet in his belt, and started on his way. He traveled over meadows, through beautiful forests in which were hundreds of birds. He was delighted as they sang and fluttered about. The journey was beautiful and pleasant to Robinson. In the forests he often saw small wild creatures, but he shot nothing. After the first night he slept under a tree in the soft grass, for he now had no fear of wild animals. Along the shore he saw great groves of palms with their large nuts. He saw, too, many goats in all parts of the island. Now he was ready to take the shortest way home. He had not gone far before he came into a dark forest. He became confused and wandered about for several days. On the 4th day he came to a little pile of stones which he had made to mark the way as he was going out. From this place the way was easy to find. On this trip he was gone already 2 weeks. End of chapter 25. Robinson again explores his island. Chapter 26. Robinson and his birds. Of all the things he saw on his journey, Robinson was most delighted with the birds. They were of the most beautiful colors. The forest was full of them. They gleamed like jewels in the deep masses of foliage. In the morning their singing filled the air with sound. Robinson had never taken much notice of the birds at home, but now every living thing attracted him. He loved to see them happy. He would watch often by the hour and learn the habits of nesting and getting food of nearly every bird on the island. Robinson did not know the names of many of the birds he saw on the island. He had to make names for them. The strangest thing he saw on his journey was the nest of what he called the yellow-tail. This bird lives in colonies and makes its nest at the ends of the long leaves of a mountain palm. When he first saw these queer-looking sacs hanging from the leaves, he was amazed. He had never seen so strange a sight. From the end of each great leaf hung a long, closely woven nest. Robinson could not make out at first what they were. Soon, however, he saw the birds come out of the mouths of the nests. Here, 100 feet from the ground, they hung their nests, but they were perfectly safe. He had not gone far from the tree in which the yellowtails had their nests when suddenly startled by a voice crying, "Who are you?" Robinson was greatly frightened and hid beneath the drooping branches of a cedar tree. He feared every moment that the owner of the voice would make his appearance, but it kept at a distance. Every few minutes from the depths of the forest would come the doleful cry, "Who are you?" Robinson did not dare to stir from his hiding place. He remained there overnight. After the night came on, he heard the strange voice no more. The next day he renewed his journey. He saw many birds that were wholly strange to him. There was a kind of wild pigeon that built its home in a hole in the rock. It was a most beautiful bird with long, slender, graceful feathers in its tail. He saw the frigate bird soaring high above the island. The number and beauty of the hummingbirds amazed Robinson. They were of all colors. One had a bill in the shape of a sickle. The most brilliant of them all was the ruby-crested hummingbird. Near noon, while Robinson was shielding himself from the scorching heat of the sun in a deep shaded glen, he was startled again by the strange voice crying, "Who are you?" He lay quite still, determined if possible to allow the voice to come, if it would, within sight. He heard it slowly coming up the glen. Each time it repeated the cry it sounded nearer. At last he saw spying at him through the boughs of the tree under which he was lying a large bird with soft, silky feathers of green and chestnut. Who are you?" said the bird. Robinson could not help but laugh. He had been frightened at the cry of a bird. But the bird that interested Robinson most was the parrot. There were several kinds of them. They flew among the trees with great noise and clatter and shrieking. Robinson determined if possible to secure one for a pet. "I could teach it to talk," he said, "and I will have something to talk to." As soon as he returned home he set about catching one. He noticed that a number were in the habit of visiting an old tree near the shelter every morning. He planned to snare one and tried several mornings, but he could not get one into the snare. He tried to hit one with his bow and arrow. He at last succeeded in hitting one and stunning it so that it fell to the ground. He ran rapidly to pick it up, but before he could get to where it lay in the bushes it had disappeared. After thinking the matter over, he concluded that it would be much better to get a pair of young birds and raise them. The old ones would be hard to tame and difficult to teach. It was easy enough to find a nest in a hollow tree. He secured from the nest 2 birds just ready to fly. He made a cage for them out of willow rods. He placed the cage at the entrance of his cave and studied how he would feed them. Much to his surprise, the parent birds discovered their young ones and brought them food and fed them through the open work of the cage. When the birds were grown they rapidly learned to talk. Robinson took great delight in teaching them. He taught them to call his name, and when he came near they would call out, "Poor old Robinson Crusoe." These birds remained for many years with Robinson. In fact, he was never afterward without a parrot. They helped him to pass away very pleasantly many hours that without them would have been sad. Another bird that Robinson loved was the little house wren. This bird was exceedingly tame and friendly. It was a very sweet and strong singer. It loved to make its nest in or near his shelter. There it would build and rear its young, within reach of his hands, while its throat was always bursting with melody. The mockingbird, too, always nested near, and awakened him in the morning with its wonderful song. Robinson became a great friend and favorite of the bird inhabitants on the island. They seemed to know him and showed no fear when near him. This pleased him very much. Chapter 26. Robinson and his birds. Chapter 27. Robinson gets fire. Robinson was now pretty comfortable. He had his bower with its chair and table. He had his cave in case of danger. He had his cellar in which to keep his meat. He would sit in the shade near the door of his bower and think of the many things he should be thankful for. But there was one hardship that Robinson could not get used to, and that was the eating of raw food. How fine it would be if only I could parch a few grains of corn in the fire. I could live like a prince, thought he, if I had fire. I would grind some of my corn into flour and make some corn bread or cakes and cook rice. He did so long for roasted meat and determined again to make the attempt to get fire. Robinson was fast losing his idle, thoughtless ways of doing things. He had become a thoughtful and diligent man in the short time that he had been on the island. Trouble and hardship had made a man of him. I must carefully think over the whole matter of getting fire, he said. He had failed twice and was now resolved to succeed. If the lightning would only strike a tree, he thought, and set it on fire. But he could not wait for such a thing to happen, and how could he keep it when once thus obtained? It was clear he must have some way of producing fire when he wanted it, just as they did at home. He thought over the ways he had tried and the one most likely to be successful. He resolved to make a further trial of the method by twirling a stick in his hands. He selected new wood that was hard and dry. He carefully sharpened a stick about 18 inches long and standing it upright in a hollow in the block of wood, began to roll it between his hands. By the time Robinson's hands were well hardened, it seemed that he was going to succeed at last. But he lacked the skill to be obtained only by long practice. "If I could only make it go faster," he said. "There must be some way of doing this. I believe I can do it. I used to make my top spin round with a cord. I wonder if I could use the cord here." The only cord he had was attached to his bow. He was going to take it off when a thought struck him. He loosened the string a bit and twisted it once about his spindle. Then he drew the bow back and forth. The spindle was turned at a great rate. He saw he must hold one end with his left hand while the other rested in the hollow in the block. With his right he drew the bow back and forth. How eagerly he worked! He had twirled but a few minutes when the dust in the hollow burst into fire from the heat produced by the rapidly twirling spindle. Robinson was too overjoyed to make any use of it. He danced and capered about like one gone mad until the fire had gone out. But that was of no matter now, since he could get fire when he wanted it. He hastened to make him a rude fireplace and oven of stones. He hollowed out a place in the ground and lined and covered it with large flat stones. On one side he built up a chimney to draw the smoke and make the fire burn brightly. He brought wood and some dry fungus or mushroom. This he powdered and soon had fire caught in it. He kindled in this way the wood in his stove and soon had a hot fire. The first thing he did in the way of cooking was to roast some rabbit meat on a spit or forked stick held in his hand over the fire. Nothing Robinson had ever eaten was to be compared to this. "I can do many things now," thought Robinson. "My work will not be nearly so hard. My fire will be my servant and help me make my tools as well as cook my food. I can now cook my corn and rice." Chapter 27. Robinson gets fire. Chapter 28. Robinson makes baskets. Robinson still continued anxious about his food supply when he could no longer gather it fresh from the fields and forest. Corn had again become ripe. He had found in a wet, marshy place some wild rice plants loaded with ripened grain. As he now had fire, He only had to have some way of storing up grains, and he would not lack for food. He knew that grain stored away must be kept dry, and that he must especially provide against dampness in his cave or his bower. If he only had some baskets, these would be just the thing, but how was he to get them? Robinson had never given a thought to either material or the method of making them. He, however, was gradually acquiring skill and confidence in himself. So far he had managed to meet all his wants. He had invented tools and made his own clothes and shelter. And now, he said to himself, I will solve the new problem. I must first study the materials that I have at hand. He remembered the splint market baskets in which his father took vegetables home from the store. He recalled how thin the splints were woven. They went over and under, he said. That is simple enough, if I had the splints. He set himself diligently to work to find a plant whose bark or split branches could be used for splints. He tried to peel off the rough outer bark of several trees in order to examine the inner layers of soft, fibrous material. He found several trees that gave promise of furnishing abundance of long, thin strips, but the labor of removing the bark with his rude, imperfect tools was so great that he resolved that he would have to find some other kind of material. Why need the strips be flat? He thought. I believe I could weave them in the same way if I used the long, thin, tough willow rods I saw growing by the brookside when I was returning from my journey. He found on trial that the weaving went very well, but that he must have strong, thick rods or ribs running up and down to give strength and form to his basket. He worked hard, but it was slow work. It was 3 days before his first basket was done. He made many mistakes and was obliged many times to undo what he had accomplished in order to correct some error. And at last, when he had woven the basket as large as he thought was suitable for his purpose, he did not know how to stop or finish the top so as to keep the basket from unraveling. At last he hit upon the plan of fastening 2 stout rods, one outside, the other inside the basket. These he sewed firmly over and over to the basket with a kind of fiber from a plant he had discovered that looked almost to be what he had heard called the century plant in the parks at home. On attempting his next basket, he thought long how he might improve and save time. He must hasten, or the now almost daily rains would destroy his ripened wild corn and rice. If I could use the coils of that long grass I saw growing in the marsh beside the rice, he thought, I could make twice the progress. He gathered an armful, twisted it into cables about an inch thick, and wove it into his frame of upright rods instead of the horizontal layer of willow canes. This answered his purpose just as well and rendered the making of large baskets the work of a few hours. He found, however, that the willow rods, or osiers, were not pliant enough to work well in fastening his coils of grass cables together. He tried several things and at last succeeded best when he used the long thread-like fiber of the century-like plant. He had, however, to make a stout framework of rods. He would first coil his grass rope into this frame and then sew it together with twine or thread made from this fiber. He afterwards tried making smaller and finer baskets out of the fiber that he had discovered, which could be easily had from the thick-leaved plant he thought he had seen at home. He first used long, tough, fine roots he had seen when digging up the tree at the mouth of his cave. Afterwards he discovered some tall, tough reeds growing nearby. He laid in a supply of those. He found that when he wanted to use them, a good soaking water made them as pliable and tough as when first cut. The making of the baskets and storing up grains made it possible for Robinson to become a farmer and thus make himself independent. This thought was a great relief to him. Chapter 28. Robinson makes baskets. Chapters 29 through 32 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 29. Robinson becomes a farmer. Robinson had now been on the island long enough to know how the seasons changed. He found that there were two kinds of weather there, wet weather and dry weather. There were 2 wet seasons in each year and 2 dry ones. During the wet seasons, which lasted nearly 3 months, Robinson had to remain pretty closely at home, and could not gather grain, for the plants were then starting from the seeds. It ripened in the dry seasons. Robinson soon found that he must have a store of corn and wild rice for food during the rainy seasons. He, however, knew nothing about planting and harvesting, nor preparing the ground for seed. He had it all to learn with no teacher or books to instruct him. He found a little space near his dwelling free from trees and thought he would plant some corn seed here. He did not know the proper time for planting. He thought because it was warm, seeds would grow at any time. It happened his first seed was put in at the beginning of the dry season. He watched and waited to rejoice his eyes with the bright green of a sprouting corn, but the seed did not grow. There was no rain, and the sun's heat parched the land till it was dry and hard on the upland where his corn was planted. "Very well," thought Robinson, "I will plant it at the beginning of the wet season, either in March or September." He did so. The seed quickly sprouted up, but the weeds, shrubs, and vines sprouted as quickly, and before Robinson was aware, his corn was overgrown and choked out by a rank growth of weeds and vines. "I see," said Robinson, "that I must thoroughly prepare the soil before planting my seed." But he had no spade and no other tool that would stand the strain of digging among tough matted roots. But he must succeed. He put a new handle in the stone hoe, or pick, he had already made. His mussel shell spade was worn out. He must set himself to fashion out another. He decided to make one from the tough, heavy wood of a tree that grew plentifully in the forest. He was lucky enough to find a tree of this kind, whose bole had been split lengthwise by the falling of an old rotten tree near it. With his stone tools and the help of fire, he managed after several days' work to make a wide, sharpened tool out of one of the large pieces split off. It was a little over 3 feet long. He had trimmed one end small and cut notches in the sides about 1 foot from the flat end. He could place his foot in the notch and thrust his wooden spade into the earth. With his rude tool he dug up and turned the soil of a small space of ground several times to kill the vines and weeds. His corn quickly sprouted after this attempt and outstripped the weeds and vines which Robinson constantly had to hold in check by pulling and hoeing. He was rejoiced at his growing crop, and went each morning to feast his eyes on the rapidly expanding leaves and ears. One morning, as he came in sight of the little clearing, he thought he saw something disappearing in the low brush on the other side as he approached. Alas! His labor had been in vain. A herd of wild goats had found out the place and had utterly destroyed his crop. Robinson sat down near by and surveyed the ruin of his little field. "It is plain," thought he, "I will have to fence in the field or I will never be able to harvest my crop. I cannot watch it all the time." He had already learned from his experience in making the fence around the goat pasture that the branches of many kinds of shrubs and trees, when broken off and thrust into the ground, will send out roots and leaves, and at length, if planted close together in a line, will form a thick hedge which no kind of beast can get through or over. He found out some willow trees whose branches broke easily, and soon had enough to thrust into the ground about 6 inches apart around the entire edge of his little field, which contained about 1/8 of an acre. After this hedge had grown so as to be a fair protection to his crop, he tried planting again at the proper season. He spaded up the ground and pulled out the matted roots as best he could, and with great pains and care planted his corn in straight, even rows. To make them straight, and each hill of corn the same distance from its neighbors, he first marked off the ground in squares, whose sides were about 3½ feet long. "Now," thought he, "I will reap the reward of my labor." The corn grew rapidly, and toward the end of the first dry season was filling out and ripening its ears. But to Robinson's dismay a new danger threatened his crop against which he could not fence. He was in despair. The birds were fast eating and destroying his partially ripened corn. He could not husk it yet. It was not ripe enough. He thought how easy it would be to protect his field if he had a gun. But he had learned that it is useless to give time to idle dreaming. He must do something, and that quick. "If I could catch some of these rascals," he thought, "I would hang them up on poles, dead, as a warning to the rest." It seemed almost a hopeless task, but he went about it. It was in vain he tried to kill some of them by throwing rocks and sticks. He could not get near enough to them. At length he laid snares and succeeded in snaring 3 birds. He had learned to weave a pliable, strong thong out of cocoa and other fiber that he was now acquainted with. The birds thus caught he fastened on broken branches of trees, which he stuck into the earth in different parts of his field. The birds heeded the warning and visited his cornfield no more that season. At the end of the season he gathered or husked his corn, and after it was thoroughly dry he shelled it from the cob with his hands. He used his baskets in which to carry his husked ears from the field to his cave, and in which to store it when shelled. He found that the ears were larger and better filled and plumper than when the plants grew wild. He selected the largest and best filled ears for his seed the next time. In this way his new crop of corn was always better in kind and yielded more than the old one. At first he grew 2 crops a year, but by experimenting he found out about how much he needed for his own use and planted once a year enough to give him a liberal supply. He observed that the wild rice grew in swampy lands, so that he did not make the mistake of trying to raise it upon the upland where the corn grew best. He saw at once that the planting of rice on low, marshy, or wet land was beyond his present strength and tools. "Sometime in the future," he thought, "I may try it." Robinson also found wild grapes in abundance. These he dried by hanging them on the branches of trees. He thus had a store of raisins for each rainy season. Chapter 29. Robinson becomes a farmer. Chapter 30. Robinson as potter. Robinson was now anxious to cook his food, to boil his rice and vegetables and bake bread, but he could do nothing without cooking vessels. He had tried to use cocoanut shells, but these were too small and there was no way to keep them from falling over and spilling the contents. He determined to try to make some clay vessels. He knew where he could get a kind of clay that had the appearance of making good ware. It was fine grained and without lumps or pebbles. He was much perplexed to mold the clay into the right shapes. He tried taking a lump and shaping it into a vessel with his hands. He tried many times, but each time the clay broke, and he was forced to try some other way. He recalled how he had made his basket out of strands of twisted grass, and wondered whether he could not make his pots in the same way. He spun the clay out into a long rope and began to coil it around a small basket, forming the layers together with his hands. This was easy, but he did not see clearly how he was going to get the basket out from the inside of the pot. He found he could copy in this way any form he wished, but he finally hit upon the plan of making a form of wicker work and coiling the clay rope inside it. For he saw that whether he succeeded or not in getting the clay free from the basket, he could use the pot, and besides, if the pot would stand the fire the basket would burn off. To dry the pots, Robinson stood them in the sun for a few days. When they were dry, he tried to cook some soup in one of them. He filled it with water and put it on his stove or oven, but how sadly had he deceived himself! In a short time the water soaked into the clay, and soon the pot had fallen to pieces. "How foolish I am!" said Robinson to himself. "The pots have to be fired before they can be used." He set about this at once. He found 2 stones of equal size, placed them near each other, and laid a third across these. He then placed 3 large pots upon them, and made a hot fire under them. No sooner had the flames shot up than one of the pots cracked in 2. "I probably made the fire too hot at first," thought Robinson. He drew out some of the coals of wood, but afterwards gradually increased the fire again. He could not, however, get the pots hot enough to turn red. He brought the driest and hardest wood, but could not succeed in getting them hot enough to turn red. At length he was tired out, and was compelled to give up. When the pots were cool, he tried to boil water in one. It was no better than the sun-dried one. He saw now that he must provide some way to get the pots much hotter than he could in the open air. He resolved to make an oven of stones large enough to take in the wood as well as the pots. It must be above ground, so that there might be plenty of draught for fire. With great labor he pried up and carried together flat stones, enough to make an oven about 4 feet high, with a chimney at one side. He had put in the center a stone table, on which he could place 3 quite large pots. He left an opening in one side that could be partially closed by a large flat stone. He worked eagerly, and at the end of the second day he was ready to fire his oven. He first carried together a good quantity of dry wood. Then he put in his pots, and laid the wood around them. In a short time he had a very hot fire. He kept this up all day and until late at night. The next morning he went to his oven and found his pots were a beautiful red. He drew out the fire and allowed them to cool slowly. Then he filled one with water and set it over the fire to heat it. Before many minutes the water was boiling, and Robinson had another reason to be thankful. He wept for joy. His patient labors had brought their rewards. No prince could feel as happy as Robinson now. He had overcome all difficulties. Starting with nothing but his hands, he was now able to supply all his wants. "If I only had a companion now," he thought, "I would have nothing further to wish as long as I stay on the island." Chapter 30. Robinson as Potter. Chapter 31. Robinson as Baker. Now that Robinson had fire, he determined to try to make bread. He had seen the servants at home make bread many times, but he had not observed closely and knew next to nothing about the way bread is made. He knew he must in some way grind the corn into flour, but how could he do this? He had no mill nor any tools with which to crush the corn. He first tried to find a stone large and hard enough out of which he might hollow a vessel or kind of mortar. He thought he could put the corn into this mortar and grind it by means of another stone or pestle. It was with great difficulty that he could get a stone of suitable size and form. After several days' trial, he at last got one cut out from some layers of rock near the shore. He made a hollow place in it. Then he took a smaller oblong-shaped rock for his pestle. He took great pride in these new tools. "I shall soon be a stone cutter," he said to himself, "as well as a farmer and a potter." But his stone mortar was a failure. The rock was too soft. Every time he thrust the pestle down, it loosened small pieces of the stone vessel. These mixed with the ground corn or flour and made it unfit to eat. There was no way to separate the sand from the crushed grain. He resolved then to try to make a mortar and pestle of hard wood. Now that he had fire, he could do this, though it cost him many a hard day's work. He found, not far away, a log of very hard wood. By building a fire at the right distance from one end he was able to separate a piece of the log. He rolled this to his cave and made a good sized hollow in it by burning. This pestle was not so difficult to make. He took a limb or branch of an ironwood tree, burned it in two at the place to make it the right length. By burning also he rounded one end and then he was ready for the grinding. After cleaning his mortar and pestle carefully, he placed some corn in the hollow and soon had some fine yellow meal or flour without any grit or sand in it. His next care was to separate the coarse outer husk or covering of the kernel from the finer parts that make the meal. He had no sieve. His net was too coarse. It let both bran and meal go through. I must make a net or cloth fine enough to sift or to bolt my flour, said he. Such was now his skill in spinning and weaving that this was not hard to do. He had soon woven in his loom a piece of fine netting which allowed the meal to shake through, but held back the coarse bran or outer husk of the kernel. Out of the dry corn that he had stored up, he now made quite a quantity of flour. This he kept tightly covered in a large earthen pot or jar that he had made for this purpose. I must keep all my food clean and protected from the ants and other insects, as well as dust and damp, he thought. His preparations were now nearly made. He had already his stove of flat stones. On this he could set his pots to boil water, cook rice and meat, but it would not do for baking a loaf of bread of any thickness. He must have an oven or enclosed place into which he could put the loaf to bake it. By the use of flat stones he soon rebuilt his stove so as to have an oven that did fine service. Now it was mixing the dough that claimed his attention. He had, of course, no yeast to make raised or light bread. He poured goat's milk on the flour and kneaded it into a thick dough. He did not forget to add salt. He placed his loaf in a shallow earthen pan he had made for this purpose. After the fire had heated the stones of his oven through, he put in his loaf and soon was enjoying a meal of cornbread and meat stew. Robinson soon tried to make cocoa from the beans of the cocoa palm that grew in the island. This with good rich goat's milk in it, he thought, the best drink in the world. He often thought of making sugar from the sugarcane plant he had discovered in the island, but the labor of squeezing out the juice was too great. He could think of no way to do this without the help of horses or oxen. Chapter 31. Robinson as baker. Chapter 32. Robinson as fisherman. Robinson was now eager to use his fire and cooking vessels. He had noticed with hungry eyes fine large fish in the creek near his cave, but he had never taken the trouble to catch any. "What is the use?" he thought. "I cannot eat them raw." It was different now, and he began to devise ways of making a catch. How he longed for a fish hook, such as he had so often used when loitering along the Hudson River. "But a fish hook is not to be thought of," he said to himself, "unless I can make one of bone." He went down to the brook and searched long for a fish bone that he might make use of for this purpose. He found nothing. "I must try something else," he thought. He remembered the nets he used to see along the Hudson and wondered if he could not make a small one to pull through the water and thus catch the fish. He had now a better source of fiber for weaving and for spinning into lines and ropes. He had discovered this when he was trying to find a good strong thread or yarn with which to bind the coils of his grass-made baskets together. He obtained fiber in great abundance from the century-like plant. He found if he broke off the long leaves of this plant and allowed them to decay, there remained a long, tough, fibrous substance out of which strong cords could be twisted or yarn made for weaving a coarse cloth or netting. Out of this he spun yarn thread to make a net about 3 or 4 feet by 2 feet. He fastened cords to 4 corners of this, tied them to a long pole, and was now prepared to test his plan for catching fish. The brook he found was too shallow for him to catch fish in this way. At the sight of him and his net, they scurried away to deep water. Neither could he succeed in the shallow water along the shore. "I must wade out as far as I can," he said to himself, "and draw the net through the water." As he did this, he was surprised at the many forms of sea life, new to him, that he saw. He, however, was careful and watchful. He walked along near the shore to a point where some rocks showed above the surface. As he looked ahead, he saw the single eye of a giant cuttlefish glaring at him from among the rocks. It was thrusting out its long arms towards him. He drew back quickly, but as he did so he was terrified to hear the snap of some huge creature's jaws near him. A great shark had seen him and had thrown himself on his back to seize him in his rows of sharp teeth, but was prevented reaching him by the shallowness of the water. Robinson was too much terrified to continue longer his attempt at fishing. He went back to his cave with only a few small ones, not worth the trouble of dressing for his dinner. The next day, undismayed, he tried again. He succeeded in drawing in some very beautiful large fish. Their sides shone as burnished gold and silver. "Now," he thought, "I will have a feast." He carried them home, carefully cleaned and dressed them, seasoned them with his salt, and broiled them over his fire. Imagine his disappointment when they proved unfit to eat. Their flesh was coarse and tough and ill tasting. He saw that the catching of fish for his table was a more difficult thing than he thought it. He must not only catch fish, but catch ones that could be eaten. He could only tell the good from the bad by trying them. He was more fortunate in his next venture. He was going along the shore at the mouth of the creek which ran near his cave, when he noticed a group of fishes, dark bluish above, with silvery sides. The largest of them were about 2 feet long. They were feeding on the bottom in the brackish water at the mouth of the creek, which, at its mouth, opened out into quite a little bay or inlet. They would take up a mouthful of earth from the bottom and let it wash through their mouths, keeping all the bits of food that happened to be in it. When one fish got a good place to feed, the others swam around it and tried to get some of the food. Robinson watched his chance and slipped his net under a group while each one was busy trying to get the best mouthful of mud. He drew up 3 quite large fish, but just as he was about to lift them from the water, one of the cords which bound the net to the poles broke, and he saw his catch fall back into the creek and dart away in the deepest water. But Robinson was not to be discouraged. He soon mended his net and at last was successful. In a short time he drew out another catch or two of fish. These proved excellent food and were so abundant as to furnish Robinson with all the fish he wanted as long as he stayed on the island. Chapter 32. Robinson as Fisherman. 3-37 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 33. Robinson builds a boat. Robinson had wished for a boat many times. He wished to explore the shore of his island. He wanted to go clear around it so that he might see it on every side. But he knew the work of making a boat would be great, if not wholly impossible. The shaping of boards to build a boat with his rude tools was not to be thought of. He knew how the Indians made boats out of bark trees, but he saw that for his purpose so light a boat would not do. He finally remembered a second Indian way of making a boat by hollowing out a large log. The forest was full of the boles of trees that had been blown down, but they were far away from the shore. At first He did not think of this very much. He had overcome so many difficulties that he thought, "Never mind, I will get my boat to water no matter where I make it, in some way." So he selected a tree trunk some distance from the bank of the little creek near his cave and began to work. He had first to burn out his log the proper length and hack it into boat shape with his stone tools. This was very slow and tedious work. He had to handle the fire with great care, for there was always the danger of spoiling the shape of the slowly forming boat. Both ends must be sharpened, but one more than the other to form the prow or forward going in. After he had shaped his boat, he began hollowing it out. This he did also by burning for the most part. He used the branches of the pitch bearing trees for this purpose, but it was so slow. He worked at his boat all the time he could spare from his regular duties in attending to his goats, his garden, and his cave. He was always making his cave larger. Every time he made a piece of furniture or stored away grain, he must make more room in his cave by digging away the earth and carrying it out. He had made a large, strong wicker basket for this purpose. He had had a vague idea that when he got his boat done he would dig a trench back from the bank of the creek and thus float his boat, but he had not thought it out clearly. "Or anyway," he thought, "I can in some way manage to roll it to the water." He must now actually plan to put some of these ideas into effect. First he went over the ground and found that to dig a trench from the water to the boat so that the water would come to the boat, he would have to dig it 20 feet deep. "I can never do this," he said, "with my poor tools." He next tried his rolling plan, but he had been so anxious to have a large boat that he had overlooked everything else. Try as hard as he might, he could not stir his boat from the spot. After many trials with the longest levers he could handle, the boat still stuck fast. It would not budge an inch. He at last gave up. "It will lie here," he thought, "to remind me how foolish it is to attempt to do anything without first having thought it out carefully." There was nothing to do but choose another tree trunk. This time he selected a much smaller one, and one that lay at the top of the little slope or incline from the bank of the creek. After another weary 6 months of work, he had his second boat ready for launching. With a good stout lever he gave it a start, when it rolled quickly down into the water. Robinson again wept for joy. Of all his projects this had cost him the most work and pains, and at last to see his plan successful filled him with delight. The next problem was how to make it go. He had no certain knowledge how far it was around the island, but he knew it was farther than he wanted to row or paddle his boat. Yet he knew from the way the wind blew that he could not always depend upon a sail to help him. He must become skillful in paddling his boat. A sail, too, would be very helpful at times. He imagined how pleasant it would be sitting in the boat sailing along with a gentle wind. "When the wind is favorable," he thought, "I will only have to steer with my paddle." So he set about weaving a sail of his sisal fibre. To do this he had to make a much larger loom than he had yet used. His sail must be at least 4 feet square. He was now so skilled in weaving that this was soon finished. He then made plenty of string, cord, and rope, put in a mast, and was ready to sail. But he did not venture far away until he had spent weeks and weeks in learning to steer, sail, and paddle his boat. Chapter 33. Robinson builds a boat. Chapter 34. Robinson as sailor. Ever since Robinson had finished his boat, he had been eager to make a tour of the island. He had indeed made a journey by land, but the deep forests and tangled vines made it very difficult to travel. His journeys had shown him but a small part of the land. He wished to know all about the land of which he, so far as he knew, was the sole master. His first care was to fit up his boat with provisions. He made some large baskets in which to carry food and a large covered jar for water. These he stored in the bow and the stern of his boat. He fastened his parasol on the stern for a shelter from the sun. He baked up a quantity of cakes or loaves of bread, and packed them in his baskets. He had woven these so carefully that they would almost hold water. At last all was ready. It was on the 6th day of November, in the 6th year of his life on the island, that Robinson hoisted his sail and set out upon this voyage of discovery. He had waited until the wind was gentle and blowing as far easterly as it does at that place. He scudded along bravely, running with the land toward the east and north. All went well until he came to a low reef or ledge of rocks running far out to sea in a northeasterly direction. When Robinson observed this, he went on shore and climbed to a high point to see if it was safe to venture. He was afraid of hidden currents or streams of water. These might carry him away from the shore and prevent him from getting around the point. He did indeed observe that there was a current running out to sea past the ledge, but he thought he could by careful paddling keep his boat from striking the rock. If he could once get beyond the ledge, the wind would help him double or get around the point. Indeed, the danger was that the wind would blow him onto the rocks. He waited for 2 days for a gentle wind. At last, without sail, he pushed his boat into the current and was borne swiftly seaward. He found the current much stronger than he thought it would be. It rushed his frail boat on past the point of the rocks and out into the sea. Try as best he might, he could not change its course. He was steadily going out to sea. He gave himself up for lost. He reproached himself for being so rash and foolhardy as to trust his fortunes in so frail a craft. How dear at this time seemed the island to him! The wind which he had depended on to help him at this point has died down, so that it was at the mercy of the current. He kept urging his boat to the westward as much as possible with all his strength, hoping that a breeze would finally spring up. He struggled on bravely until about noon. He had been carried out a great distance into the sea, but not so far as to lose sight of the land. All at once he felt the breeze freshening up. It caught his sail, and soon his boat was cutting across the current. He did not have to go far before he was free from it, and making headway for the island, which he reached about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He found himself on the northern shore of the island, but before long the shore ran away to the southward again. He ran briskly along the west side until he found a little bay or cove. He determined to enter this, draw up his boat on shore, and make his way back home across the island on foot. He was almost exhausted with his great labor and was worn out with anxiety. In the center of the arms of the cove he found a little creek entering the sea. He paddled into this and found a good place to hide his boat. As soon as Robinson was again on land, he fell on his knees and with tears in his eyes thanked God for his deliverance. The island, which had seemed to him a prison, now seemed the fairest and dearest place in the world. Having made his boat safe, he started back toward his shelter, but he was too tired to go far. He soon came to a little grove of trees, beneath which he laid himself down and soon was fast asleep. You can imagine with what surprise Robinson was awakened out of his sleep by a voice calling his name. "Robinson! Robinson Crusoe!" it said. "Poor Robinson Crusoe! Where are you, Robinson? Where have you been?" He was so fast asleep that he did not at first rouse up entirely and thought he was dreaming. But the voice kept calling, "Robinson! Robinson! Poor Robinson Crusoe!" He was greatly frightened and started up, but no sooner were his eyes opened than he saw his parrot sitting on a branch of a tree. He knew at once the source of the voice. Polly had missed her master and was also exploring the island. It was a pleasant surprise. She immediately flew to him and lit on his shoulder. She showed in many ways how glad she was to see him and kept saying, "Poor Robinson Crusoe! Poor Robinson Crusoe!" Robinson remained here overnight and the next morning made his way back to the shelter. Up to this time Robinson had never seen any dangerous animals on the island. He had grown used to life there, and went about without fear of animals. But, as he was returning across a little opening, he saw a clump of palms in the center of the opening, swaying about. He did not at first see what caused this, but soon there was thrust out the head of a great serpent. Its jaws were open and its eyes were fixed on a poor terrified little rabbit. The rabbit seemed rooted to the spot. It could not stir a muscle and was soon caught in the folds of the great snake. This sight made Robinson greatly afraid. He wanted to rush to the rescue of the rabbit, but what could he do against such a foe? He resolved in the future to keep a more careful watch and always to sleep in his bower. Robinson had enough of exploring for some time. He was contented to remain at home. He made many things he needed. He had saved all the skins of the goats he had killed for meat, and all that had died from any cause. These he made into rugs for his bed. He kept at his loom, too, for he was anxious to weave enough of his coarse cloth to make him a suit of clothes. He learned how to braid mats and rugs out of his fibre, and finally replaced his awkward hat and parasol with others braided very skillfully from the long grasses that grew so abundantly in the marshy places. Another thing that Robinson was now able to make or weave out of his fibre was a hammock. He had slept all this time on a bed made of poles laid lengthwise and thickly covered with the skins of goats and rabbits. Now he could have a comfortable place to sleep. He did not stop until he had made two. One was for the bower and the other was for use out of doors. When his work was done in the evening, or in the heat of midday, he would lie in it at full length under the shade of the trees. Chapter 34. Robinson as Sailor. Chapter 35. A Discovery. Robinson could not forget his boat. It seemed a companion. It may be the means of my escape from this place, he thought. He took frequent journeys across the island to where his little boat lay in a cove. He would start out in the morning and walk over to the west side of the island, take his boat, and have a pleasant little sail. He always returned home before dark, for, to tell the truth, Robinson was a coward. He was as timid as a hare. He was afraid of everything and spent many nights without sleep because of fear. It was while on one of his visits to his boat that Robinson made a discovery that changed his whole life. It happened one day, about noon, when he was going toward his boat, that he, with great surprise, saw the print of a man's naked foot on the shore in the sand. He stood like one rooted to the ground. He could not move, so great was his surprise and fear. He listened, looked around, but could hear and see nothing. He went up to a little hill to look further, but nothing was in sight. There was but the one footprint. There was no doubt about it. There it was, foot, toes, heel, and every part of a foot. Robinson tried to think how it might have gotten there, but he could not. It was a mystery. He was greatly afraid and started at once for his shelter. He ran like one pursued. At every little way he would look behind to see if anyone was following him. Never a frightened rabbit ran to his hiding place with more terror than Robinson ran to his cave. He did not sleep that night for fear and remained in his shelter for 3 days, never venturing out. But his food was growing short and his goats needed to be milked. He finally, with 1,000 wild fancies, forced himself to go about his duties. But he could not get the footprint out of his mind. He spent many sad and fearful days thinking about it. How could it have gotten there? Whose was it? Was the owner savage or not? What did he want on the island? Were some of the questions that haunted him. Perhaps, he thought one day, I just imagined I saw a footprint. Or perhaps it was one of my own that I have made when I was going to sail my boat. He took courage at this and began to go about the island again, but he went in great fear, always looking behind him. He was always ready to run at the first sight of danger. He had made himself a large, strong new bow and plenty of arrows. He carried these in a quiver he had made from his cloth. He fashioned, too, a sharp pointed lance-like weapon which he hurled with a kind of sling. In his belt he carried some new sharpened stone knives. He had found a better kind of rock out of which to make his knives. It resembled glass and could be brought to a fine keen edge. Armed thus, he began to have more confidence. He had a strong desire to see the footprint again and make up his mind about it. He wished to measure it. In this way he could tell certainly whether it was a chance print of his own foot or not. So after a few days he again ventured across the island. Alas, on measuring the print, it was much larger than his own. There could no longer be any doubt that it belonged to someone else. Again great fear fell on poor Robinson. He shook with cold and fright. He resolved to make himself more secure against attack. He cut and carried willow stakes and set them in a thick hedge around in front of his shelter. This was outside the first and enclosed it. In a season or two these had grown to such a height as to shut out all view of his home from sight to one coming to it from the front. His flock of goats gave him many troubled thoughts. His goats were his greatest treasure. From them he obtained without trouble his meat, his milk, and butter. What if they were discovered and killed or carried away? He resolved to divide his herd into 3 parts and secrete these in separate fenced pastures in different parts of the island. His herd of goats now numbered 25. He made thorough search about the island for the most secluded and best hidden spots where he could fence in a pasture. One day, as he was exploring on the west side of the island to find another open space for a goat field, he thought he spied away out to sea a boat. He looked long and anxiously, and yet he was not sure that it was a boat he saw. But how easy, thought Robinson, for the people of the mainland, which must be at no great distance to the westward, to come across to this side of the island in fair weather. He thought, too, how fortunate he was to have been cast on the east side of the island, for there he had his shelter in the very safest part. As he was coming down from a hill where he had gone to get a better view of the sea, he made another discovery. About him everywhere at the foot of the hill were bones of all kinds. Near by, too, were charcoal and ashes. There could be no mistake. This place was visited by human beings. These were very likely savages. Everything showed that they came for the purpose of feasting and not for plundering. It was very likely that they neither sought anything on the island nor expected it. This thought greatly relieved Robinson. He returned home in a very thankful and composed state of mind. He had now been on the island almost 18 years and had not been discovered. Yet, no doubt, the island had been visited many times by the savages since he had been there. In a short time his fear of discovery wore off, and he began to live just as he did before his discovery. He took, however, greater precaution against surprise. He always carried his bow and arrows, his lance and knives. He was also very careful about making a great smoke from his fire. He burned a great quantity of wood in a pit and made charcoal. With this material he had a fine fire with very little smoke. Every day, also, he went to the top of the hill back of his shelter in order to discover if possible the approach of savages. Chapter 35. A Discovery. Chapter 36. The Landing of the Savages. Another year passed by. Robinson longed more and more to get away from the island. Year after year he had hoped and watched in vain for a passing ship. Every day he would scan the waters that held him prisoner for the welcome sight of a sail. He had been disappointed. Now his only hope was to escape to the mainland in some way. He feared the savages. He had heard stories of their being cannibals. But if they could come to this island in their canoes, against the prevailing winds, why could he not get to the mainland with it in his favor? Strange as it may be, Robinson began to wish for the return of the savages. He hoped to watch them at a distance and find out something about their customs. More especially he wished that he might capture one of them. He had two reasons for this. In the first place, he would have a companion. He pictured fondly how he would teach him gentle manners and the English speech. And too, the companion would be able to help him. Besides this, he longed above all to know more of the mainland and whether it would be safe to go there. He wanted to find out in what kind of boat they made the voyage. He thought that if he had such a person he would have someone to show him the way to reach the land. The more he thought, the more anxious he became to see the savages on the island. He thought so much about it by day that he dreamed about it at night. One night he dreamed that the savages came, drew their boats upon the shore, and began to prepare their feast. As he watched them, one of their number broke away from his fellows and came straight toward his hiding place. Robinson thought he rushed out, drove away those that followed the fleeing man, and rescued him. This dream made a deep impression upon him and made him await the coming of the savages with great hopes and eagerness. It was more than 18 months after he had formed this plan of capturing one of the savages before the savages made their appearance. Robinson was surprised one morning to see no less than 5 canoes drawn up on the shore at a point on his side of the island, about 2 miles below his shelter to the south. The people that had come in them were on shore and out of sight. Robinson went back to his shelter to make his plans. He made up his mind that he would be foolish to attack them. There must be 25 or 30 of them. He finally went to a point where he could see farther inland and soon caught sight of a crowd of about 30 savages. They were naked and dancing around and around in a circle. All the while they were singing and making hideous noises. There was a fire in the center of the ring of savages. "They are cooking their feast," thought Robinson. "Maybe I can surprise them while they eat and rush in and seize one." But this seemed too great a risk to run. He had no weapons but his bow and arrows, his lance and knife. What could he do against so great a number? But fortune favored his plans. As he gazed at them from his safe distance, he saw one of their number break away from the rest and run with utmost speed directly toward his hiding place. At once 2 other savages pursued him. They had no weapons but clubs. They ran with great swiftness, but the man in front was steadily gaining ground. Robinson, now to tell the truth, was dreadfully frightened to see the savage run directly toward him and his shelter. He kept his place, however, and watched the race. The man running away ran along the shore and would soon come to the little creek that emptied into the sea below his home. Robinson saw that the savage would have to swim this to escape. He ran down thither and concealed himself behind a tree and waited for the fugitive to come up. As he did so, the fleeing savage plunged in and swam across with a few strong strokes. When he was well on the bank, Robinson presented himself and made signs to him to come to him, that he would help him. The savage was at first almost overcome with astonishment and fright, for Robinson presented a very unusual sight. The savage at once ran to him and fell down at his feet. Indeed, so great was his fright and distress that he placed one of Robinson's feet upon his neck, in a sign that he yielded up his life into his hands. Robinson raised him up and motioned for him to take the lance and help in defense against the men now coming up. They hid behind trees and waited for them to swim across the stream. But this they did not do. When they reached the creek, they could see nothing of their runaway. They very slowly turned and went back to their companions. Robinson was well content not to let them know that there was anyone on the island. He feared they might return and destroy his shelter and fields. Robinson took the savage to his shelter and gave him bread and raisins to eat and a cup of water to drink. He was very hungry and ate greedily. After he had eaten, Robinson made signs for him to lie down and sleep, for the Indian was nearly tired out with his long and swift run. He was a handsome fellow of his race. His limbs were large, straight and strong. He had a good face. His hair was long and black, his forehead high, and his eyes bright. His skin was not black, but of an olive color. His teeth were fine set and as white as ivory. He slept about an hour. When he awoke he came running to Robinson and again made signs to him that he was his slave. "You saved my life," he seemed to say, "and now I will serve you." Robinson named him Friday at once, for that was the day on which the great event of his escape had taken place. Robinson's next care was to fit him out with some clothing. He had by this time several suits made of his coarse cloth. He soon had Friday dressed in one of the old ones, with a straw or braided hat on his head. He did not think it safe to allow Friday to sleep with him in the bower. He made a little tent for him inside the enclosure. This was covered with goat skins and made a very good protection from both the heat and rain. Robinson took care to keep all his knives and weapons near him in the bower, but his fears that Friday might harm him were unfounded. Friday from the first was faithful to his master. He was sweet and obedient in all things. He seemed to look upon Robinson with the love of a child for its father, and never tired of serving him. Chapter 36. The landing of the savages. Chapter 37. Robinson as a teacher. From Robinson's diary. I began to consider that having now 2 mouths to feed instead of 1, I must provide more ground for my harvest, and plant a larger quantity of corn than I used to plant. So I marked out a larger piece of land and began to fence it in. Friday worked not only very willingly, but very hard. I told him that it was for corn, to make more bread, because he was now with me. He let me know that he was grateful for my kindness and would work much harder if I would tell him what to do. This was the pleasantest year of all the life I led in this place. Friday began to talk pretty well, and understood the names of almost all the things that I called for, and of all the places which I wished to send him, and I was careful to teach him all the things I knew. I showed him how to plant and harvest corn, how to gather fiber, spin yarn, and to weave it into cloth. He learned these things quickly and became very skillful in making pots. He knew something about this because at home he had seen the women make them. He ornamented them with figures of birds and flowers. I taught him about the true God, but as for writing, he could never do much with this. I had no books, and could not make him understand the importance of writing. He began to talk a great deal to me. This delighted me very much. I began to love him exceedingly. He was so very honest and faithful. After I had taught him English, I tried one day to find out whether he had any wish to return to his own country, and as I talked to him about it, I saw his face light up with joy and his eyes sparkle. From this I had no doubt but that Friday would like to be in his own country again. This for a time made me sad, to think how eagerly he would leave me to be among his savage friends. "Do you wish you were back in your own country, Friday?" I said to him one day. "Yes," he said, "I'll be much glad to be back in my country." "What would you do there?" said I. "Would you turn wild again and do as the savages do?" He shook his head and said very gravely, "No, no, Friday tell them to live good. He tell them to plant corn and live like white mans." One day when we were on the top of a hill on the west side of the island, Friday suddenly began to jump in the air and dance about in great glee. I asked him what the matter was. "Oh joy! Oh glad!" he said. "There my country!" The air was so clear that from this place, as I had before discovered, land could be distinctly seen looking westward. I asked him how far it was from our island to his country, and whether their canoes were ever lost in coming and going. He said there was no danger, no canoes were ever wrecked, and that it was easy to get back and forth. I asked him many things about his people and his country. He told me that away to the west of his country there lived white mans like you. I thought these must be the people of Central America, and asked him how I might come from this island to get among these white men. He made me understand that I must have a large boat, as big as 2 canoes. I resolved at once to begin to make a boat large enough for us to pass over to the land we could see lying to the west, and if possible to go on to the white man's country Friday told me about. It took us nearly 2 months to make our boat and rig her out with sails, masts, rudder, and anchor. We had to weave our sails and twist our rope. We burned out the canoe from a large fallen log. We used a great stone tied securely to the end of a strong rope for an anchor. When we had the boat in the water, Friday showed great skill in rowing or paddling it. He had managed boats ever since he was old enough, but he did not know how to handle a sail or rudder. He learned very quickly, however, to sail and steer the boat, and soon was perfectly at home in it. We made our boat safe by keeping it in the little cove at the mouth of the creek. I had Friday to fetch rocks and build a dock or place for landing. But the rainy season was now coming on, and we must wait for fair weather. In the meantime, I planned to lay by such quantities of food as we would need to take along. Chapter 37. Robinson as a teacher. 38 and 39 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 38. Another Shipwreck. One evening Robinson sat in his shelter thinking of his plans to escape to Friday's country. He was sad, for after all this place was very dear to him. It was the only home he had. Had he not made everything with his own hands? It was doubly dear to him on this account. He thought how it would grieve him to leave his goats, his fields, and the many comforts he had here. He had been telling Friday of his home in New York. He told him of the great city and of its many wonderful sights. He told him of his country and its people, of his flag and its history. All these things brought back memories of his boyhood, and he wondered what changes had come in his long absence. Friday, with wonderful intelligence, listened to all Robinson told him. He was delighted in hearing Robinson tell of the wonders of the great world, for he had never known anything about it. As they talked, Robinson noticed the approach of a storm. The sky was getting black with clouds. The winds were blowing a hurricane. The waves were coming in mountain high. It reminded him of the eventful night, now 25 years ago, when his ship was tossed up on the shore like an eggshell and broken to pieces. Suddenly there was a sound that made Robinson start from his seat with the wildest alarm. Was it the sound of a cannon from the ocean, or the terrible crash and roar of the water on the rocks of the coast? There it is again. It is a cannon. Some ship is in distress. This is its signal. Robinson ran out and down to the shore with Friday at his heels. "Oh, master," said Friday, "can we not help? If they only knew the island was here, and how to steer into the harbor beyond the point of land on the south." Robinson was so excited that he scarcely knew what he was doing. He ran up and down the shore calling wildly, but the awful roar of the sea and wind drowned his cries. Suddenly his thoughts came back to him. "Quick, Friday, get some fire into a pot. We will run to the point, gather grass and wood, and make a fire there. Maybe we can guide them into the harbor." They soon had a great beacon light sending its welcome greeting far over the sea. The pilot of the ship saw it and steered his ship nearer and nearer. Robinson was ready to shout for joy as the ship seemed about to make the harbor. The ship had her sails torn in shreds and her rudder broken. It was hard to steer her in such a gale. On rounding the point she was blown on the rocks. With a frightful crash, which could be heard above the din of the storm, she struck and held fast. Robinson could hear the cries of the men and the orders of the officers. They were trying to get boats ready to be put off, but such was the confusion of the storm and the enormous waves breaking over the deck that it could not be done quickly. Before the men could get a boat into the sea and get into it, the ship gave a lurch to one side, as though about to sink. All the men jumped for one boat. It was overburdened. The wind tossed it about. The sea soon filled it and went down, and all were lost. Robinson and Friday remained on the shore all night. They watched to see if they could not help some poor sailor that might cling to a plank and be blown on shore. They saw no one. At last they lay down, but they could not sleep. Many times they sprang up and ran about for fear that some poor fellow would need their help. At last morning came. The storm ceased. Robinson and Friday searched everywhere for the bodies of sailors, but could find none. But the wind had blown the ship in plain view, and into shallow waters. It was lying on the bottom, with more than half its bulk out of the water. The masts were gone. It was a sad sight. No human being could be seen on it. They were now rejoiced that they had their boat ready. "Let us take it," said Robinson, "and go out to the ship. It may be some person is still on the unfortunate ship." They were soon by the ship's side. They rowed around it until they saw a rope hanging down from the deck. Robinson seized this and clambered up. Friday tied the boat fast and followed. Robinson opened the door leading from the deck into the ship and went down. He searched in all the cabins and knocked at all the doors. He called, but all was still. When he was satisfied that every person on board had been drowned, he wept bitterly. Friday stood there with open and staring eyes. He looked and looked. He was astonished at the large ship and at the wonderful things before him. They were in the cabin where the passengers had been. There stood trunks under the benches and clothes hung on the hooks on the wall. One trunk was open. In it were telescopes through which the travelers had looked at the land. Robinson also saw paper, pens, pen holders, and ink. Books were also near by. Robinson first took a thick book. It was the Bible, out of which his mother had so often taught him. Then they came to the sailors' cabin. There hung muskets and swords and bags of shot and cartridges. Then they went to the workroom. There were saws, hammers, spades, shovels, chisels, nails, bottles and pails, knives and forks, and something more, over which Robinson was most glad, matches. At last they came into the storeroom. There lay bags of flour and barley, teas, lentils, beans, and sugar. Then Robinson embraced Friday in his great joy and said to him, "How rich we are!" Chapter 38. Another shipwreck. Chapter 39. Saving things from the ship. After Robinson had looked through the ship, he began to plan the way to get the tools and things he most wanted on shore. He and Friday first carried everything together that he wanted to take on shore. When they had done this, he found he had the following things. Robinson stood everything together that he needed the most. 1. A case of nails and screws. 2. 2 iron axes and several hatchets. 3. A saw. 4. A small case of planes, tongs, augers, files, chisels, etc. 5. A third case with iron brackets, hooks, hinges, etc. 6. A case of matches. 7. A barrel of gunpowder. 8. 2 muskets and a pistol. 9. Several swords. 10. A bag of cartridges. 11. A large sail cloth and some rope. 12. A telescope. By means of the ship's ropes, Robinson let everything down into his boat. He himself took the Bible, and then they rowed to the shore and unloaded the boat. Everything was put into the bower where rain could not harm it. By the time they had this done, night was coming on, and they decided to do no more that day, but wait until the next day. "We must work fast," said Robinson. "The first storm is likely to break the ship in pieces and destroy everything in it." The next morning early they ate a hastily prepared breakfast and were off to the boat. Neither Robinson nor Friday stopped for their noonday lunch. "A storm is brewing," said Robinson. "The air is calm, the sky is overcast with clouds, and the heat is oppressive. We must hurry." With the utmost diligence they rowed back and forth all day. They made 9 trips. They had now on shore a surprising quantity of all kinds of tools, goods, and weapons. They had all kinds of ware to use in the kitchen, clothes, and food. Robinson prized a little 4-wheeled wagon and a whetstone. But in looking over his stores, Robinson suddenly discovered that he had no needles or thread. They went at once to procure these important articles. In looking for needles and thread, Robinson found a small trunk full of money and valuable stones. There were diamonds, rubies, pearls, and much gold. Robinson pushed it to one side. "What can I do with riches on this island? I would give them all for some needles and thread," he said to Friday. But on second thought he took the trunk and its contents along with him to his cave. For in the trunk were also letters and writings. "Perhaps," he said, "these tell to whom the valuables belong, and I can return them some time." Robinson at last found a case containing everything one could need with which to cut and sew cloth. There were scissors, thread, needles, thimbles, tapes, and buttons. But now the wind was rising and they must hurry. They were nearly ready for departure. They were passing through a part of the ship not before visited. They were surprised to hear a sound coming from a room whose door was kept shut by a heap of stuff that had been thrown against it by the violent pitching of the ship in the storm. Robinson and Friday cleared away the rubbish and were surprised to find a dog almost drowned. He was so weak from want of food that his cries could be heard a short distance only. Robinson took him tenderly in his arms and carried him into the boat, while Friday carried the sewing case and trunk. The wind was now blowing a gale. A few yards from the ship they were in great danger. Robinson grasped the rudder and made Friday stand ready to cut away the mast in case they found the wind too strong. With the greatest difficulty they finally made the little cove at the mouth of the creek and were soon landed with their precious cargo. The next morning they eagerly searched the waters for the ship. Not even their field glasses could reveal anything of it. Some planks, a mast, and parts of a small boat were blown on shore. All else had disappeared. Robinson set to work at once to make a door for his bower out of the pine wood cast up by the waves. How easy the work proceeded with saws, hammers, augers, squares, planes, nails, hinges, and screws. With the wagon, too, Friday could now gather his corn quickly and easily, or haul in great quantity of grapes to dry for raisins. Friday had never seen a gun. He did not know the use of firearms. The muskets that Robinson had brought from the ship were a great mystery to him. Robinson showed him their use. He showed how they could defend themselves. He told Friday that these weapons could kill at a distance. He took some powder and touched a match to it. Friday was greatly frightened. Robinson then proceeded to load the gun. He put in some powder, a ball of lead or bullet. Then at the hammer he placed a little cap which gave a flash when struck. This ignited the powder. When all was in readiness, Robinson bade Friday to follow him. They went slowly out into the forest along the stream. Soon Robinson espied a rabbit sitting under a clump of grass. Robinson raised his gun, took careful aim, pressed the trigger. There was a flash and a loud report, and there lay the rabbit dead. But Friday, too, was lying on the ground. He had fainted from astonishment and fright. Robinson dropped his gun and raised the poor fellow up to a sitting position. He quickly recovered. He ran to get the rabbit. He examined it carefully. Robinson at last pointed out the hole the bullet had made, and the mystery of the way the rabbit was killed was solved. Robinson had lived alone so long that he had learned to love every living creature on the island. He never harmed anything except when he needed food. He had lived so quietly that the birds and animals did not fear him. They lived near his shelter and seemed to know him. Robinson was delighted with his new tools and weapons, but they reminded him of home. Nothing that he had seen in all the time he had been on the island so turned his thoughts toward home and friends. Robinson would sit for hours thinking of the past and making plans for the future. He was homesick. End of chapter 39. Saving things from the ship. Chapter 40. The return of the savages. Robinson now renewed his plans for escaping from the island to Friday's country. They first rebuilt their boat with their new tools. They hollowed out the center till the sides were thin toward the top. They shaped her sides and keel. They made her prow sharp so that she would cut the water easily. They made a new mast, strong and tall and shapely. They made larger and stronger sails and ropes. They made 2 pairs of extra oars. They made boxes and cupboards in the prow and stern for keeping their fresh water and provisions. Friday's eyes sparkled with joy when it was done. He hoped he would now be able to return to his own island and parents. Robinson noticed his joy and asked him, "Do you want to return to your own people?" "Yes," said Friday, "very much." "Would you trust yourself in this boat?" "Yes," said Friday. "Very well," said his master. "You may have it and start home when you please." "Yes, master, but you come too. My people will not hurt you." Robinson resolved to venture over to Friday's land with him. But before their preparations were complete, the rainy season of our fall set in. They resolved to wait until the weather was settled, and as soon as the rainy season was over to set out. They ran their boat well up into the creek and covered it over with a large tarpaulin made of sailcloth obtained from the ship. Robinson had now been on the island 27 years. For the last 3 years he had lived happily with his companion Friday. Every year in September Robinson celebrated the day his life was saved and he was thrown up on the island. Robinson celebrated it this year with more than the usual thankfulness. He thought that it would be his last anniversary on the island. One morning Friday had gone to the beach to find a turtle. Soon he came running back out of breath. "Oh, master," he cried, "they are coming! They are coming to take me prisoner!" He was trembling with fright. "We must take our guns and defend ourselves," said Robinson, "but we will not kill anyone unless they attack us." This quieted Friday. They loaded 4 muskets and 3 pistols. Robinson put the pistols in his belt, where he also fastened a sword. He gave Friday a pistol and a musket, for Friday had learned to shoot well. Besides, Friday carried a bag of powder and bullets. Robinson took his field glasses and saw 21 savages with 2 prisoners. The prisoners were bound and lying on the ground. This was a war party celebrating a victory with a feast. They probably intended to kill their prisoners. "We must save the lives of those men," said Robinson. The savages this time had landed quite near Robinson's shelter, not more than half a mile below the creek's mouth. Soon he and Friday started off. Robinson commanded Friday to follow quietly and not to speak or shoot. "We will surprise them and give them a good scare," said Robinson. When yet a considerable distance away they could hear the savages yelling and screaming. Some of them were dancing their war dance. Their faces and bodies were painted to make them look terrible to their enemies. They were dancing around their prisoners with hideous cries and gestures. They could now see the prisoners plainly. One had a beard and was plainly a white man. Robinson was surprised and determined to save him at all risks. "Get your gun ready to fire," he said to Friday, "and when I say the word let us run forward yelling and firing our guns over their heads. This will fill them with such fright that they will take to their heels and boats and get away as soon as possible. In the scramble and confusion we will rush in and rescue the prisoners." This plan did not please Friday at all. His savage blood was up, and he wanted to kill all he could. "Let's fire on 'em," he said. "Let's kill all but the prisoners." "No, no," said Robinson. "It's always wrong to take life unless it cannot be avoided to save one's own. Let's try my plan first." With great reluctance Friday consented. At a signal from Robinson they rushed forward, and when in plain sight they fired off their muskets in the air. If the ground had suddenly exploded beneath their feet, there could have been no more confusion, astonishment, and fright. A few took to their heels. Others lay as if dead. They had swooned from fright. But as Robinson came up, they jumped to their feet and pushed into the boats, leaving the prisoners behind. Robinson and Friday still rushed forward and fired their remaining loaded guns and pistols in the air. The savages made all haste to get into their boats and push off. Soon they were well out to sea, paddling rapidly for the west. Robinson reloaded his arms and gave them a farewell volley, but not a soul was killed or even wounded. This gave Robinson great pleasure. He had accomplished his purpose without bloodshed. They could now turn to the prisoners. Robinson ran back to them and quickly cut their ropes. Robinson asked the white man who he was, but the man was too weak to answer. Robinson gave him a piece of bread. The fear of death being removed, the white man soon grew stronger. When Friday came running back from watching the boats and saw the savage that had been a prisoner, he gave a loud yell. He threw his arms around the man, kissed him, and laughed and cried for joy. He put his head on his breast and hugged him again and again. Robinson was greatly surprised and puzzled. He asked Friday what his actions meant, but so intent was Friday that he got no answer. At last Friday recovered far enough from his great joy to say with his face beaming in delight, "Oh, master, this man is my dear father." They at once began a long conversation. Each one told his story. Suddenly Friday jumped up and said, "How foolish I am! I have not thought to give my father anything to eat or drink. He must be nearly starved." And away he ran toward the shelter and was soon back with food and water to drink. Robinson learned through Friday from his father that the white man was a Spaniard, that he had been captured by the tribe that had a battle with Friday's people. The Spaniard was one of 16 men that had been saved by Friday's people from a wrecked ship. So weak were the prisoners that they could not walk to the shelter. Robinson and Friday made a litter and carried them one after the other. When once there, Friday prepared some rich rice soup. The prisoners ate heartily, and in a few days were strong enough to go about the island. Chapter 40. The return of the savages. 1 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allyson Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 41. Deliverance at Last. Friday had not forgotten the plan for going to his home. He would often mention it and spent hours talking about it during the long rainy season. But now that the Spaniard and Friday's father had come into the family, Robinson felt he must change his plans a little. He felt very sorry for the Spaniards left in Friday's country. They did not have enough to eat and were sick and sad besides. He talked the matter over with the Spaniard many times. They at last planned to send for them. The Spaniard and Friday's father were to go. Robinson was for doing it at once, but the Spaniard advised delay. "How can we get food for ourselves and 15 others? Your small store will soon be used up," he argued. Robinson at last saw that this difficulty must be overcome. There was just one thing to do, and this, to delay their departure until a new crop of corn could be raised. This would take 6 months. But at it they went. The 4 men could do much and work fast. They cleared more ground and planted all the seed corn they could spare from their store. Besides this, they sowed about 12 bushels of barley they had gotten in the ship. The care for so much crop, its harvesting and storing away, kept them very busy for the season. Robinson not only did this, but also increased his flock of goats by catching kids and putting them in his pasture. He gathered, too, all the grapes he could and dried them on the branches of the trees. At the end of the harvesting season they made ready their boat. They filled it with all the bread it could well carry. They put in raisins and fresh water. Robinson gave the Spaniard and Friday's father each a musket and plenty of powder and bullets. Now all was ready. Friday gave his father a loving farewell. He stretched out his arms towards him as the boat moved away. The Spaniard and Robinson waved their hats and they were off. They promised to be back in 8 or 9 days. Robinson and Friday made every preparation to receive the guests. They were to have a home not far from Robinson's built of poles and thatched with the long marsh grasses, like Robinson's bower. There was no need of hiding or defending it. It did not take long to fix up. 8 days had now passed since the boat had left. Friday could hardly restrain himself longer. He watched the ocean all the time. He would go to the top of the hill with the field glasses every hour during the day to catch a first glimpse of them. On the 9th day, as Friday put up his glasses to search the waters, he dropped them with a yell of surprise. He tore down the hill with the utmost speed and rushed up to Robinson as one gone mad. "Look, look, master!" he cried. A big ship way out to sea." Robinson took the glasses, and sure enough, there, within hailing distance, was a large ocean-going vessel. Robinson was overcome with excitement. For 28 years his aching eyes had scanned the waters for this welcome sight. His joy was boundless. The ship looked like an American. Yes, there floated the American flag. How welcome a sight to Robinson! He could not utter a word. Tears filled his eyes and streamed down his cheeks. He would soon have news from home. He ran to the shore and shot off a gun to attract the attention of those on board. He heard answering shots at once. Soon a boat was lowered, and in it 3 men rowed toward the shore. It was the captain himself and 2 sailors. The captain was astonished to find a man in the lonely island. Robinson told how it all had happened, and how he would like to return home. To his unspeakable delight, the captain told him that the ship was bound for New York and would take him along free of charge, but he must leave that day. The ship could not be delayed any longer. Of course Robinson would go. Friday was beside himself with grief. He did not want to be left behind alone. He did not know that the Spaniards would ever return. Something might happen to them on the sea. But before the eventful day, the Spaniards landed. They brought word that Friday's father had died after his return home. Friday was thrown into a fit of grief at the news. He wept and repeated over and over his praise of the good man. End of chapter 41. Deliverance at last. Chapter 42. Robinson at home. It was with a sad heart that Robinson made ready to leave. Every familiar place seemed now doubly dear to him. He went from one to another with tears in his eyes. Here lay his home. Here were his fields, his crops, and his goats. Everything was the work of his own hands. He had made them all. Which should he take? He hesitated long. He must take home some of his belongings to show the people at home. And there were his parrot and the dog, which had won a place in Robinson's heart. He decided to take them along. At length he got together his diary, his parasol, his Bible, his treasures, a suit of clothes, his dog, and a hat. He had saved, too, his bow and arrows. These he decided to take along. Everything else he gave to his good man Friday and the Spaniard, who wished to be allowed to remain on the island. Robinson kissed Friday tenderly. He with great effort finally tore himself away and ran to the shore where the ship's boat awaited him. But Robinson had not counted on the strength of Friday's love for him. Robinson's boat had not yet reached the ship when Friday sprang into the water and swam after him shouting, "Master, take me with you. I would rather die than stay here without you." Robinson was touched at the devotion showed by the faithful Friday, and gave orders to turn the boat back and take him on board. The anchor was raised. The ship started on her way to the home Robinson had left so long ago. The wind was favorable, and in 7 weeks the spires and buildings of his native city were in sight. His vessel came slowly up to the wharf where he had taken ship so many years ago. Here, too, he had played and idled his time away. He remembered it all. His idleness and playing truant came back in sad memories. Before Robinson and Friday landed, their good friend, the captain, gave them each a new suit of clothes. Everything had changed. He scarcely knew the place. He was astonished and confused by the din, hurry and bustle of a great city. Friday seemed dazed by it all, and clung to Robinson's side. The buildings were so tall, the street cars, the carriages were different. Everywhere there were iron machines, casting out smoke, puffing and running about on iron rails. Robinson had never seen these. Robinson, however, did not stop to admire. He pushed on to a certain street and house where lived his parents at the time of his departure. It was with difficulty that he found the place. It was now in the heart of the city. Upon inquiry he found, after much searching, that his father had removed his store and home to another part of the city. His mother had died of grief for her disobedient son. Robinson was sorely grieved at this. He had hoped to see her and tell her how sorry he was that he had caused her so much anxiety and sorrow. When he had found the place where his father lived, he stole quietly up to the house and opened the door. His father, now a gray-haired man, bent with age and sorrow, was sitting in his armchair reading. Robinson came forward, but his father did not recognize him. "Who are you?" he said. "I am Robinson, your long-lost son." He knelt by his father's side and asked for forgiveness for all the trouble he had caused. His father was overcome. He could not speak. He drew Robinson with feeble hands to his breast. "My son, I forgive you," he said. Robinson's boyhood friends heard of this strange return. They had thought him dead long ago. They never tired of hearing him tell his strange story. They pitied him in his misfortune, but Robinson told them that it all happened to him because he was idle and disobedient in his youth. Robinson at once relieved his father at the store. The business thrived. His father died. He soon had a home of his own with a happy family. Friday, the dog, and the parrot lived in it, dearly beloved and cared for by their master the rest of their days. In the home there is a young Robinson who loves to hear his father read from his diary of the wonderful things that had happened to him on the island. Robinson tried many times to find the rightful owner of the gold and jewels, but never succeeded. At last he gave them to a school where boys with idle habits were taught to lead useful and industrious lives. End of chapter 42. Robinson at home. End of An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. This has been a LibriVox recording read by Allyson Hester in April 2008.